Welcome back to the Solutions Manual podcast. I'm Sarah Farwell,
And I'm Maciek Zatonsky.
and today we're going to talk about weight loss drugs. This is your Ozempic, Wegovy, and
Mounjaro is one of the popular ones as well now. So we've mentioned those specifically that we inject, right? The injectable ones.
right.
Yes. So the new ones that have recently taken the world by storm,
That's right.
becoming very popular as well, not necessarily among patients.
Well, not necessarily among what the population that they were originally designed for, right? Which
Right.
was diabetes control.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah. One of the reasons we want to talk about this is because when we think about longevity and health, weight management long term
Mhm.
is one of the goals, right? And
Yes.
while we've seen that a lot of the benefits of these weight loss drugs give you the weight loss part of it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily give you the long term maintenance aspect of it for those who
That
are
is correct.
not diabetic and then who eventually, hopefully, come off of it, right? So we want to address
Mhm.
this. And
That's correct.
and another reason is because of that, there's a lot of myths around it. There's a lot of questions, and a lot of people luckily have support groups online, in person. And there are a couple of frequently asked questions that maybe we can also work into our discussion today, too.
Mhm. Yes, I think it will be an interesting discussion in general on weight loss that we will have today, and especially weight maintenance.
Mhm.
I believe that a lot of people will subscribe to what I'm going to say next. It's much easier to lose weight than to keep your new weight.
Yeah,
And it doesn't really matter how you achieve that loss, whether this is through your own efforts or using pharmaceutical shortcuts, the problem remains. So we'll dig into the details and into the science of how it works, why it's difficult, and what you can do about this.
right. And if it was easy, then everybody would do it, right? It wouldn't be so difficult.
It
So
is, yeah, the principles are simple, but they're not easy.
simple, but not easy. Right.
Mhm.
So why don't we start with defining it, the class of drugs, how
Mhm.
this came to be used for patients for weight loss, and kind of clarify what the mechanisms are, what the intended mechanisms are,
Mhm.
and then we can answer some of these questions that come up in some of these groups.
Let's do that.
Mhm.
Because in order to fully understand how those drugs work, we
Mhm.
need to dig in how the human body works as well. But I think you said, yes, it's a class of drugs which we call GLP-1 agonists. We'll go into those details a little bit more in a minute. And they're not necessarily new. The GLP-1 agonists, the first one, was identified in animals, I think, over 40 years ago in the 1980s.
Mhm.
They were later developed as commercial medicines, which are essentially the modification of the animal product from the 1980s, and relatively recently licensed for use in humans in management of diabetes,
Mhm.
which is, I think, what we need to go back a little bit and talk about why diabetes and what's the diabetes context and how the human body regulates glucose levels
Mhm.
in order to understand the body, but also in order to understand where those medicines come and what the role is and what they actually do to us and why do we lose weight? Because it's not like the drugs make us burn fat. It's much more complex, and the implications of that complexity will impact people's results, side effects that they might suffer from, and also what happens when they discontinue the treatment. Very basic, very basic terminology first. I think starting with basic hormones that people would be familiar with would be a good place. So insulin is a hormone. It's produced in the pancreas. It is one of the most, let's say, profoundly important hormones in the regulation of the function of our body because it impacts essentially the function of every cell. So insulin instructs the tissues in our body to take glucose, which is a form of sugar, carbohydrate, in our bloodstream, and at the same, so it makes that glucose goes into tissues, but it also instructs your liver to stop producing more glucose, and that typically happens in response to the food that we eat. So that we can say that the main purpose of insulin is to instruct your body that it has been fed, like there's enough of energy in the body. Now, typically this instruction to your body happens in response to consumption of sugars or carbohydrates, because that's where the molecules will be converted into glucose, which will reach your bloodstream, and where the insulin response will happen. So in short, you eat a slice of pizza, your pancreas will start producing insulin. Insulin will tell your liver to stop producing more glucose and also tell your tissues there's plenty of energy, please use it. So insulin will therefore regulate the processes that will be happening inside of your body, and it will also have an impact of what happens when there is an excess of energy. But insulin, on top of this, will also regulate the output of the second hormone. And the second hormone that we'll talk about is glucagon. So glucagon is produced also in your pancreas in different cells, and it's you can say it acts a little bit in an opposing way to insulin. So it tells your liver to produce more glucose, to produce more energy. It will also increase the breakdown of fat and increase production of something we call ketones. And ketones are essentially byproducts of fat metabolism. They also can be used as a source of energy for our cells. So as you can see, you have two hormones that kind of work together. They're trying to maintain a certain balance in a healthy individual. And when one hormone goes up, it regulates the function of the other. So one influences the level of others. Now, there's also a third group of hormones that we call incretins, and they are also released in response to the things that we eat. I mean, this is something that most people would be less familiar with. So we'll spend a little bit more time here. The role of the incretins is to magnify the production and secretion of insulin. So this is like an amplifier. Think of this as an amplifier of the response that we have to the food that we eat. So GLP-1 is one of those hormones, and it can stop the release of glucagon into your bloodstream. They also have other functions. So GLP-1 can slow down the absorption of content from your gut into the bloodstream. And it can also slow down the speed at which the food will move through your gut. We call this the rate of the stomach emptying. So basically, when you fill up with food, this GLP will make the stomach empty slower. So you have an impression that you're staying full for longer. And in fact, the vast majority of the insulin response after eating is not directly contributed to how much sugars you have eaten, but how much of it's primarily due to the function of the GLP-1 incretin. So this is the amplifier that makes your body produce more insulin in response to glucose.
And GLP-1 stands for?
Great question. So so GLP-1 is glucagon-like peptide 1. That's what it states like. So it's a glucagon, which we talk about, like peptides, which is essentially a protein, type 1. This one is produced in something that we call the L cells in your body, and it works together with another one that's produced by the K cells, which is called GIP or GIP, which stands for glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. So again, a complex name of another incretin, and again, they work together in response to the food that you eat. Now, both of those, the GIP and GLP-1, are responsible for increasing the speed of insulin production as well. Okay, so they kind of work together, and the key difference between them is that the GLP-1 can increase the storage of lipids, of fats, and GLP-1 drives down the release or the secretion of glucagon. And another difference, which we've already touched upon, is that GLP-1 lowers the rate of stomach emptying, GIP-1 not necessarily. But in short, both increase the amount of insulin that your body will produce and decrease the release of glucagon, which in turn lowers the blood glucose levels. Now, why is this a problem for most people, especially for people who are dieting, is that high levels of insulin instruct your body to store fat. It basically tells your body that there's enough energy that you have just received. It needs to be taken into tissues. And if it's not immediately used, it's going to be converted into fat. But we're going to talk about this later. So the drugs that we have mentioned at the beginning, the pharmaceuticals, called GLP-1 agonists, were developed as initially as a management of type 2 diabetes. And why? It's because they have impacts on production of insulin by your body, right? Much stronger impact than the consumption of sugary or foods or carbohydrates. Now, the development program for those medicines was relatively long. Again, diabetes is a common condition. There are already existing treatments, so anything new needs to be studied in detail. When the GLP-1s were trials, we've seen in the trials significantly improved ability of people with type 2 diabetes to control their glycemic response, so essentially controlling their blood sugar levels. Now, this is a good thing for people with diabetes, but another thing that the researchers have noticed is that pretty much everyone who was still taking those medicines over time started losing weight. Now, this observation led to essentially over time to licensing of those medicines as pharmaceuticals for weight loss. And I'm using weight loss here specifically in distinction to fat loss. And we're going to talk about this, Sarah, I'm sure, in more detail, because those two things are not the same. Losing body weight is not the same as losing excessive body fat.
And in the original trials that we're talking about, how many patients were in the trials?
Yeah, so the trials were relatively large trials. One of them was done on a group of over 10,000 people with diabetes, where they were compared to the controls, and the controls included placebo, but also other classes of drugs like SGLT2 inhibitors and others, and also the GLP-1 agonists. Now, multiple drugs with multiple potential impact were tested, and one of them, semaglutide, which is commonly known as, I think, Ozempic or Wegovy. I think those are the most common trade names or brand names of semaglutide. The semaglutide performed better than any other drug in that trial and significantly better than placebo. So those trials were extended and published, I think, in 2020, so relatively recently, in one of the major medical journals on significantly obese patients. So you needed to have a BMI of more than 30 without diabetes, purely to see what the impact of those medicines will be on weight loss. And this time, participants were also counseled every month in the clinical trial. And they also told to exercise for at least 150 minutes per week while staying on those treatments. We will talk as well, I believe, today, why this exercise regimen and counseling in relation to how to eat were important in the clinical trials. We're probably going to touch upon whether this is also happening in clinical practice, or do people who take those medicines actually receive regular coaching and mentoring and counseling on how to eat while taking those medicines and how to exercise and why it's absolutely important. But essentially, what the researchers have seen in the trials is that while people in placebo, so not receiving a therapeutic intervention, but receiving counseling and dietary advice in the same way and exercise advice, lost some weight. I think on average, it was about 2% of body weight. The people taking semaglutide lost significantly more weight than
Over
people
what amount
receiving
of
just
time?
dietary advice. Hmm?
Over what amount of time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the I think the separation was seen as early as 1 month already. So already after a month, the weight loss in people receiving semaglutide or Ozempic was visibly more on average than for people just receiving dietary advice.
Mm.
For most people that who were just counseled after 3 or 4 months, the weight remained stable, but it continued to drop down for people receiving semaglutide for up to a year.
Mm.
So over the year observation, the drop in body weight in people receiving injectable GLP-1 agonists was essentially continuing. The rate was slowing down as it would be expected, but the weight loss was continuing for the duration of the observation. And approximately half of the people in the trial lost more than 15% of their body weight. And I think that over 30% lost more than 20% of their original body weight, which if we look at dietary interventions in general over the course of the year, it's really impressive results, right?
Yeah.
So for an individual weighing 100 kilograms without any significant effort, being able to lose 20 kilograms over the course of the year is remarkable,
Yeah.
or at least appears to be on the first glance.
Right.
Yes, so there were other things that researchers looked at in that study, and they looked at certain biomarkers, so predominantly at the reduction in the levels of insulin, especially on the empty stomach, and those differences were quite significant as well. They looked at certain liver biomarkers, which they've seen marked reductions in liver function biomarkers as well. So the elevation of ALT and SAT was definitely different between those groups. And I think that again, on average, those are quite impressive results. But on top of this, and this is which we alluded to at the beginning, when it comes to weight loss, it's not the same thing as fat loss. So people receiving semaglutide were losing on average of 5 kilograms of lean body mass, so of muscle mass,
Mm.
during the observation time, compared to only 1.5 approximately in the placebo group. So while both group lost weight, a significant amount of that weight was coming from the loss of the muscle functions. And that comes in that this is a clinical trial result on patients who are receiving coaching and counseling on what and how to eat, and were also instructed to regularly exercise 150 hours of exercise, minutes of exercise every week as the bare minimum, which again in real life might be very different.
Mhm.
So even we would expect this with every type of diet, every type of weight loss will lead or is likely to lead to the loss of muscle mass. But even in the individuals who receive appropriate dietary advice and regularly train, this is a still significant decline. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is the medicine that makes you lose muscle mass. It simply could be related to the rate of which you are dropping weight.
Right.
Now, this is significant. We're going to talk about this as significant as well. Now, because it's a pharmaceutical intervention, that we need to say a little bit about the side effects. Side effects were common in people receiving injectable GLP-1 agonists, but they're mostly mild. And most people, they're mostly mild, and typically they're related to gastrointestinal symptoms. So people feeling nauseous or having stomach pains or not having any appetite, not being able or willing to drink or eat, which contributes to the weight loss effect of taking those medicines. The side effects seem to be dose related. So the higher dose you take, the more side effects you should expect to experience, which is fairly normal. But some of the side effects that observed in the trials could probably be contributed to the weight loss itself. We know that because there will be, those things would apply to any diet, right? So your gastrointestinal disorders are fairly common in people dieting without using pharmaceutical. interventions. So this is broadly what those drugs do, what they are, and how they work.
So just to summarize so far, we've just done an amazing job of summarizing the original studies that started by looking at GLP-1 agonist semaglutide, otherwise known as Ozempic, originally in patients with type 2 diabetes, because it's a GLP-1 agonist that essentially is upstream of insulin and will tell the body not to regulate in a way that makes sense for type 2 diabetes patients. But as a secondary result of that study, there was significant weight loss, which is not the same as fat loss, weight loss
Mhm.
compared to a placebo group. So then that study was expanded to evaluate that a little bit more,
Mhm.
showed that in addition to weight loss, there were changes also significant compared to placebo in
Yes.
liver function and other biomarkers. So the use of the drug for weight loss in non-diabetes patients
Mhm.
that was the expansion of semaglutide. And
Mhm.
there were side effects that are still commonly experienced, whether someone is taking this who's a diabetes patient or not. But essentially,
Yes.
the medicine tends to make people feel full, which contributes to the weight loss, which includes fat and muscle loss, which we'll talk more about. Anything else to summarize for the paper?
Yeah, I think you're nailing this. This is essentially what the clinical development program showed, right?
Yeah.
Originally, the observation of weight loss was later investigated further solely for that purpose. And
Yeah.
those drugs are now licensed for the management of excess body weight. It's
Yeah.
a, and again, it's a pretty big thing if we think about this, because this is essentially the first time where people can fight with obesity in a way with very little effort. It's almost like it sounds like magic, right? You take an injection, your appetite immediately goes down. There's not much you have to do. Well, you don't need to be diabetic to benefit from that. You don't feel hungry.
Mm.
And a lot of patients describe the impact of injecting themselves as very like something they've let's imagine someone who has been struggling with appetite control for their entire life.
Right.
They easily overeat, they consume large amounts, they probably diet many times, and they could never sustain it. Now they inject themselves, let's say once per week, and it's like somebody turned a switch, right? The
Right.
feeling of being hungry completely goes away.
Right.
There's more. For a lot of patients say that it's not just that they're no longer hungry, it's when they try to eat, it feels like eating on full stomach, even if they haven't eaten for 2 days.
Mhm.
So it's essentially like not eating without effort. That's
Right.
what the drugs allow you to do.
Right.
And so again, it sounds like magic, right? You suddenly stop being hungry. There's no need to eat anymore. If you try, it feels like things like you're full, like there's nothing else you need to eat. And over time, over the course of first few weeks, over the first 4 weeks, you will see or you will notice that you start losing weight, right? You put yourself through the injection of hormones into energy deficit, right? So you will be consuming probably far less than you have been eating before.
Mhm.
That effect is relatively immediate. And also because of the way the drugs were trialed and they're typically prescribed, there is a certain dose escalation protocol. So you start with injections at slower amount of medicine, and over time, over the course of the next few months, you increase the number of the hormones that you're injecting yourself with. This regimen is essential for the control of the side effects of the medicines, but it also means that over the course of the next 4, 6, 8, 12, 16 weeks or so, the amount of hormones that appetite suppressants will be increasing. You will be less and less hungry, and the weight loss will be probably accelerating.
Yeah.
So it is also very motivational for people to stay on those drugs. One, because of the ease with which they work, relatively little effort. It's not that we have to go and take tablets all the time. It feels easy, and of the effects that most people will see very, very quickly, right? In a matter of weeks, rather than months or years.
Right. Now, before we move on to some of the questions we see and
Hmm.
getting a little bit deeper into what happens when people come off of it, just want to just put a disclaimer here that this discussion we're having, now that we've summarized the original study, is for education and is not meant to be medical advice. So we intend this to be a supplement to conversations that you would have with your medical team or your
Hmm.
physician. So we'll still link the article and we'll still link
Hmm.
some supplementary material, but this is this is just a conversation. So yeah, I just want to put that in there too.
Hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right, Sarah, and thank you for that reminder for our audience. We're not giving medical advice here, but we're discussing a lot of medical topics and pharmaceutical topics, so people have a better understanding of how those medicines work. And one of the reasons we're doing this is, again, because those medicines are now used commonly for
Mm,
people who are not obese and
mhm.
for people who are not necessarily having diabetes.
Yeah.
In fact, at a certain point in the United Kingdom, so many people were using or purchasing those medicines outside of their typical narrow indications, that there were supply shortages in the UK for several months for people with diabetes because it was simply impossible to obtain on prescription because it was being bought off by people for using it for lifestyle reasons. I remember NHS has deployed a special prescribing guidance as well for physicians to re-educate them, and it was specifically designed for the GPs, again, to increase the chances of patients who are sick of actually being able to receive the drug, which was in a short supply.
Right. Right.
So yes, became very, very popular, right? And
Mhm.
I think the other disclaimer I would like to make here is that we use this word Ozempic because this is the one that has been most heavily marketed. It was probably one of the first ones on the market. It's a form of semaglutide. Um, and it's the one that people most commonly refer to. But I just want to bring our listeners' attention that semaglutide comes under two different brand names, so Ozempic and Wegovy. This is the same substance, and both are injectable. There is also an oral formulation that is available in some countries of semaglutide. I don't remember the brand name. I believe it started with R, although I don't remember from the top of my head. And there's also a different substance, different molecule, which is called tirzepatide, which is slightly different to semaglutide because it's not just GLP-1 agonist, it also works on the GIP,
Mm.
the one of the incretins that we have discussed at the beginning. And this one is sold or marketed as Mounjaro, and it has been shown in studies to be even more effective for weight loss than semaglutide is. And we will definitely link the studies to both. I believe there was about 5% difference. The people on 5% difference in the total amount of body weight loss over the course of 40 weeks or so on Mounjaro than it was on Ozempic. Those should not be compared, and again, the results will probably differ between individuals. And at the time that the studies were conducted, the Mounjaro was not licensed specifically for weight loss. At that time, it was only for management of diabetes. So it's also important for our listeners.
Now, depending on the person and their goals and their health state, they they are potentially able to stay on these on a medication indefinitely, right? But can you talk about the benefits of working into your plan to eventually come off of this medicine? Why someone would want to come off? And
Mhm.
then what generally any general trends we see when people do come off of the medicine?
Yes, that's a great question. So we know from the studies that at some point probably about a year in to treatment,
Mhm.
the rate at which you are losing weight will decline and eventually will plateau.
Mhm.
Right, so it will stabilize. So you will notice that despite continuing to inject yourself and being appetite suppressed, you're no longer losing weight. You've reached a certain point where your body will no longer, for most people, will no longer allow you to drop any further down, even
Even
if
after
even
dose escalation.
yes, even following the maximum dose that you're allowed to take. So
Right.
for most people, it does plateau, and I think that for most people will not see significant effects after about a year. That's where they peak
Mhm.
in terms of the body weight lost.
Yeah.
So what do you do then? Do you stay on treatment? Which makes perfect sense if you're a diabetic, and that's the primary reason why you're using the drug, right? That's you should probably continue. But as every pharmaceutical treatment, there are side effects, both short-term and possibly long-term,
Mhm.
of those medicines. So the question remains, if you have reached your, let's say, target body weight, you've lost the amount of weight that you wanted to, what do you do next? Do you continue to supply and buy that medicine for the rest of your life, taking into account the possible side effects, or do you come off of it? And what happens after you come off of it? And I think this is probably the core of our conversation today. This is the most important thing that we will be discussing today. So, Sarah, you have a lot of experience in general in nutrition, right? You're a certified expert in that space, and you know that there are many people who go on diets of any type, any sort. They do initially lose weight, but
Yeah,
most of them will struggle to keep it off.
that's
And we
right.
also know that the vast majority of people, and again, we'll probably go into this deeper in this or maybe next podcast episode, will eventually regain the weight that they lost. Often they will regain, well, they'll get more. They will be heavier than they started after some time, after they discontinue or go back to their previous diets. It's sometimes called the yo-yo effect or comes with different names. But the
We've been
fact remains,
Yeah,
people struggle.
people struggle. Yeah. Whether they were on medicine or not.
That is correct,
Yeah.
right? So we know from what happens now after you discontinue taking the medicines. So
Mhm.
the question is, can you keep your new weight and how?
Mhm.
So since the GLP-1 analogs have now been studied for quite some time, the data is now available that shows that the results are sustained and people plateau after a certain amount, typically after a year from starting the treatment. But we also know what happens if at the moment when people stop taking those medicines. It's very clear, I think, from this 2022 study done by the Wilding and his team, that the very moment you stop injecting yourself, you will start rapidly regaining your weight.
Right.
And I think, and we'll put those graphs as well for our listeners so they can see how fast that regain is. I think that when you discontinue the drugs, I think within 6 weeks you can undo 6 months of progress or something like this. It's like it's very, very quick.
Yes.
Now, and that weight regain is irrespective of previous loss. So it doesn't matter how much you have lost, it will happen. Now, the study that we are referring to from 2022, the observation wasn't long enough. So there's a certain cutoff from the availability of the data. We observe essentially the same patterns as we do for any other person who dieted. The
Yeah.
moment your appetite goes back and the moment you start injecting yourself, your weight will start to rapidly go up. Why is this a problem? I think that's something we will discuss. So Sarah, you as the expert, why is it a problem when people rapidly lose weight and then start regaining it?
Well, I think there's physically, obviously, you don't want to have extra weight. You want to be able to maintain a healthy BMI.
Mhm.
And the time that someone spends trying to reduce weight and reduce fat, for that to come back quickly is
Mm.
physically difficult. It puts physical load and extra strain on your body and your organs and your
Yes.
metabolism, but it's also psychologically very difficult as well.
Mhm.
Um, the investment, time and money and intention that someone spends maintaining a regimen to reduce weight is significant. So to have that be reversed in a short amount of time is very discouraging and puts a lot more burden on not just the person but the
Mhm.
system as well, health system as well. So, and we also kind of alluded to this before, but losing weight
Mm.
includes losing muscle and fat. And this is why this counseling aspect for exercise, and more specifically resistance training, in the original study was so important. So there are, depending on the person, of course, and a lot of this depends on the individual, but when someone discontinues a diet or discontinues a medication or changes something that then is likely to result in weight gain, there the missing piece tends to be the exercise or resistance portion. So while working with a registered dietitian or nutritionist or group for what to eat and when and is helpful, without the exercise component, especially the older we get, the the more likely that is to occur just in general. Now, staying on the medication we're talking about today indefinitely still requires an element of intervention as far as physical fitness. And that's why putting things in place before and as early as possible, and by putting things in place, I don't mean just habits. It's really understanding what what you can do day by day, month by month, year by year to be able to reduce the likelihood that you'll regain weight, whether you're on or off the medication, a medication at all. So
Mhm.
it's strain, it's time, it's health. It puts you at risk for other disease. It is very difficult for people to to put back on and maintain a healthy muscle fat ratio after that as well. So there are some misconceptions about this weight loss aspect of it. Again, it is also dependent on the person to some extent, but in general, what we see is, well, you can talk about more of the percentages and proportions, but weight weight loss, the weight loss aspect
Mhm.
when someone is in that downward trend, probably losing more muscle than they think.
Mhm.
Either because the resistance training portion is not optimized yet or missing, and or their protein intake is also not optimized. And that so it becomes this cycle of
Oh, yes.
not being
Mm.
hungry, but needing to feed myself with protein, which makes me not hungry, is very filling. So that brings a lot of difficulty as well.
It does, and it's especially difficult if you're trying to follow something that we probably both don't really like, is the standard American diet. Especially if you think about the way of eating that would preserve or at least try to reduce or minimize the loss of muscle mass, the lean body mass, while reducing the overall body weight, right? So
Right.
that it does become a challenge. So just to recap, losing weight is not the same thing as losing fat. And we know that the total amount of muscle mass from the health point of view is one of the most strength and mass and lean body mass are the two most important predictors of longevity, of living healthy for a long time. So we have loss of lean body mass while on the medicine,
Yeah.
We have regain on discontinuation, which is mostly from fats,
Yeah.
and that's 2 or above the starting body weight, with its psychological issues and emotional issues and financial consequences.
Mhm.
We also have, we've covered that people who are on those medicines will suffer from, things like nausea or lightheadedness or, uh, reduced ability to exercise. They're not delivering, they're eating less, so there's essentially less energy coming in. Some
Yeah.
suffer from diarrhea, some vomit, some have symptoms of sinusitis or upper airway infections, some have headaches, some have abdominal pain.
Mhm.
But there are more important issues related to that as well, right? So one we've covered with the significant implications for longevity, for living healthy for a long time, is the reduction of your lean body mass, and that becomes even more problematic as you get older.
Yeah. Right.
Yes, I mean, after all, like you would like to be able to carry on your own grocery when you're in your 70s or 80s,
Mhm.
and we also know that from the early 20s, it's very easy to lose muscle mass. And those changes exacerbate as we are getting older. So everything we do and every time we diet, when we lose muscle mass and we regain primarily fat, not only it makes us sicker and less likely to live healthy for longer, it also makes every subsequent attempt to lose body weight again more and more difficult.
Great.
Yes, which we'll probably discuss later, either in later today on a different episode.
So, so you have this magic pill. Sorry, before you go on. So we have this magic pill that helps us lose weight. We can be counseled to do exercise and resistance training, which we know is essential, especially the older we get. So it's not that the good news about muscle mass is that you can build it. You can still build it. It's just
Yes.
it needs to become more of the priority of when you
Yes.
are under a pharmaceutical intervention, because while the overall weight loss aspect of it is relatively easier than maybe someone might have experienced before,
Mhm.
when you add in age, your sex, your relationship with food in general,
Mhm.
becomes a balancing act to be
Yes.
to maintain while you still want to lose weight, and then of course after.
Yes, absolutely. So to minimize again, treatment of obesity is a major win, I believe, in medicine. Obesity is the driving factor of multiple health problems and a significant contribution to shortening people's lives. Why we have an epidemic of obesity, we have tons of people suffering from long-term consequences, from metabolic diseases, from type 2 diabetes, from cardiovascular diseases, from strokes, from dementia, which is all of them related to the same problems, namely inadequate diet and inadequate amount or type of exercise. And those drugs do help people with those problems, but they do not help to address the root cause of them. And as you have correctly highlighted, the dietary intervention that needs to happen to control or reduce the lean body mass loss is important, as well as the appropriate exercise regimen that needs to be almost religiously followed while taking those medicines. As it was, and don't forget that the results we're discussing today, they refer to people who are in a controlled clinical trial environment.
Right.
I, as a physician, can tell you that it is highly unlikely
Mhm.
that the vast majority of the people who are taking those medicines
Mhm.
do 150 minutes of resistance exercise every week
Yeah.
and that they are receiving appropriate guidance, counseling, and coaching when it comes to nutrition. It's probably even less likely that they meet the required protein targets,
Yeah.
especially if they follow the publicly available advice. And those things will have a profound impact of what will happen over time,
Yeah.
especially when they discontinue those medicines. I believe the one thing that we haven't covered as well, but we know that has been shown by some researchers, is that in people taking GLP-1 agonists, they do report an increase in resting heart rates. We know that your resting heart rate is indicator of your cardiovascular performance, and that additional strain, I think it's from 8 to 15 beats per minute during night rest, is probably a significant finding as well. We know that the levels of insulin are elevated by more than half, or like more than 50% in patients receiving GLP-1 agonists. And we also know that the heart rate variability, which is another indicator of, in a way, of a cardiovascular and emotional regulation, let's say, tends to go down in some patients. However, those parameters do go back to normal after people are taken off the treatment, which is another indication or a hint that maybe staying on those medicines, if you're otherwise healthy and there's no risk of suffering or not being able to control diabetes, for example, being able to step down and stop using those medicines is probably a good thing for your health. But by far the most important are the changes in body composition. So the losing lean body mass and regaining fat at discontinuation. And I would also bet my license when we discuss the results from clinical trials, they will not resemble real life. I think you recently mentioned in a conversation that we've been having that you have listened to a few conversations online that people had, and it looks like their ability to be able to eat properly and exercise properly, and their knowledge about this topic is close to zero.
Now,
This, yeah,
now the translation between a clinical study and then the real world application of that is often not the same. So it's not that it's surprising that a controlled environment would have a certain set
mm,
of very carefully measured specific criteria predetermined. That was the point of the study. Doesn't mean that the outcomes would be necessarily overall different, but the patient behavior and adherence certainly is changing. And with, like you said, the widespread use of this, it is there's a lot of information and there's a lot of people struggling.
yes,
And that's where these frequently asked questions come in some of these groups because, like you said, the dosing, the protocol, the exercise regimens compared specifically to a placebo group, which is
mhm,
part of a controlled clinical trial, is meant to determine the magnitude of specific outcomes that we are looking for, whether it's biometrics in this case or
yes,
weight loss. Whereas you use this in the real world, there are things that you can and cannot control, which is okay. But the issue is the planning aspect and the tracking aspect is
absolutely,
removed. So, but then what do people do about it? They're no longer necessarily under the kind of clinical protocol or even physician care or even dietitian care while they are taking this. And so it sort of is, I'm experiencing a certain side effect. What do I do? Is this normal? Is it, and a lot of these side effects are, and the weight loss is so quick that people don't have time to make an appointment 6 weeks from now to rediscuss this. You want to be able to get information and guidance right away, but it also highlights how individualized responses and regimens should be, and
yes,
how it really depends on the person. And one of the other frequent questions are, what should I eat? And that again depends. It depends. The answer is not as straightforward. Of course, we're talking about supplementing with protein because your exercise regimen to maintain or reduce the reduction or minimize the reduction of muscle mass becomes
mm,
even more critical when you're on this medication. But specifically what people should eat really depends.
On an individual.
Mm.
Mhm. Yes, and don't forget that those things are also essential when dieting in general, when dieting for weight loss in general, right? The preservation of your muscle, body mass is quite an important thing to do and to get right. But when you are appetite suppressed, it becomes even more challenging. And when you are in severe energy deficit, it makes it more difficult to exercise, especially when it comes to, again, resistance training.
Yeah.
So the nature of the appetite suppression and the consequences of it, which is lower energy, lower intake, lower willingness to eat, forcing yourself to consume sufficient amount of protein, which is again one of the most micronutrients that makes you fill and full very quickly, and gives you this perception of satiety, becomes even more challenging. So it's not an easy thing to get right while you're taking those medicines, and you have limited time window in which from the moment you start taking those drugs to the moment that you will have to discontinue taking them, where you can learn the habits that will be necessary to maintain your new weight for the rest of your life, right? Because we have to think, we look at the trials which have a 1 year time frame, but we're talking about individuals who are expected to live for 20, 40, 60 years.
Mhm.
And the challenge is that as we get older, our energy demands continue to decline.
Mhm.
So that's another thing that needs to be factored in. And people who are willing to maintain the weight that they lose, they need to be very, very careful
Yeah.
to use the time while they're on that medication to build habits that are necessary to sustain it. Otherwise, it's a lot of risk, it's a lot of side effects, it's a lot of potential long-term consequences. If you are going to regain everything in fats that you've lost, in muscle, back to your original body weight, but just in fats, you're going to end up in a worse place than you have been.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
so
think the statistics show, and may depend specifically on whether it's semaglutide or other, at
th-
least half of the people, if not usually more like 70 to even 90% of people
yes,
who discontinue regain at least two-thirds of the weight that they had lost.
yes, but that's within the first few weeks or few months. And we know when we look at the trends, because again, those trials are at some point stopped.
Mhm.
This is very likely that regain will continue. We
Mhm.
also know that in long-term observations, a significant amount of people will gain more than their original starting weight. And let's don't forget they will gain mostly fat, right? Unless they are on a well-controlled dietary regimen and regular exercise regimen. But to be completely honest, if they were in the first place, they probably wouldn't be obese in a way that requires pharmaceutical intervention in the first place. So yes, those drugs are great, but they need to be used wisely, and people need to learn to use that time, what they're taking them, to build habits that are necessary to sustain the weight. Otherwise, it just doesn't seem to make much sense.
So if we come back to protein
Mhm.
and fiber, can you talk about what generally how people can set targets or understand what protein and fiber targets might be and why that's so important during and after a specific weight loss goal?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, Sarah, is that um, preservation of lean body mass should be an important aspect of every diet. And in order to get this right, most people would need to, protein and fiber are two of the most under consumed nutrients
Mhm.
in a general population. This means that for the vast majority of people, when they start, when they embark of whether pharmaceutically induced or not, any dietary regimen that puts them in an energy deficit, a significant amount of energy that the body will need to produce to maintain itself will come from the decomposition of their own muscle tissue up to a certain level. And there are two ways to prevent it, or actually there's one way to prevent it, but it requires another. So the way to prevent muscle decomposition or decline in your lean body mass is resistance exercise. In order for the resistance exercise to be effective, there must be a sufficient surplus of the building blocks, the amino acids that build muscles, available to those individuals, and that means they need to be consumed. They need to be introduced into the diet. So you need to have a protein surplus in order to build new muscle tissue, or at least prevent its decline. And this becomes more important as we get older. For an average person, I believe that the recommended amount of protein to consume should be approximately 2 grams per kilogram of target body weight.
Mhm.
This is significantly more than what the standard American diet would recommend. I personally believe that the recommended amount of protein recommended by the American standards today is close to starvation level. I think it's basically what is necessary for you to survive and relative health rather than to thrive, or not even close to what's required to maintain or build new muscle. And let's don't forget that, as we talked before, building or adding muscle mass becomes critical as we get older. And it's essential during weight loss programs. So my recommendation would be at least 2 grams of protein per kilogram of target body weight.
And there are others who recommend this as well. And recently, the National Academy of Sports Medicine did issue a statement that the current general recommendations for the American standards are 30 to 50% below what they believe it should be. It's so this is a widespread recommendation as well at this point, and we can link that too.
Yes, we can. You're absolutely right, and we see this from National Institute of Health of National Research Institutes as well now in certain recommendations, for example, in hypertensive management, to significantly increase the amount of protein consumed versus what the standards recommend. We know that the certain researchers or experts in that, longevity experts like Dr. Atia, recommends at least 2.2. We know that in certain performance training and training environments, the recommendation is up to 3 grams in males per kilogram of target body weight. But that's when we're significantly with nutrition plans that are specifically designed to add a significant amount of muscle mass in short time. We also know that it depends on a source of protein. So we have studies to show that if people are consuming primarily plant-based sources of protein rather than animal-based sources of protein, then that number can probably needs to be doubled. And that's related to the lack of availability of certain amino acids in plant-based proteins. So this is a relatively complex topic, but as a general rule, the majority of the recommendations, the standard recommendations, are not sufficient to maintain lean body mass while being in energy deficit. And consuming high amounts of protein needs to be paired with resistance training. And also the proteins needs to be consumed relatively uniformly throughout the day. And because the couple of hours after we had our last protein-rich meal, this will go away. So appropriate nutrition planning and appropriate meal composition is essential while taking GLP-1 agonists, or in fact, on being on any other diet. I mean, this is one of the reasons why people often get this, the rebound, the yo-yo effect, is primarily because of that, right? They start at a certain level, they lose a significant amount of body mass, they lose muscles as well, they regain mostly fats, and they end up in a place where they need to eat far less than before, even to maintain the body mass at which they started, purely because they have a less lean muscle. And we know that the lean muscle mass is a primary driver of the basic metabolic rate. So the amount of calories you burn when you're sleeping or you remain inactive.
And fiber?
So fiber is that's a separate topic. Fiber is, I think, another of the most under-consumed nutrients, and it does not necessarily or immediately contribute to weight loss itself, but it significantly contributes to your gut health. Now, this is important. It's an important topic which we're probably not going to discuss in today, but it provides the necessary, let's say, food for the microbes that are living in your stomach. It slows down the absorptions of other nutrients from your gut. It's essential for staying healthy and also for prevention of numerous. It's been linked to prevention of cardiovascular diseases. It's been linked to the reduction of gastrointestinal cancers. Fiber is an essential nutrient that is necessary for our health, and it's again primarily derived from green leafy vegetables. Fiber for people who have not eaten this before is a relatively interesting thing to introduce, because this will definitely disturb your stomach at the beginning. So a lot of people who are not used to consuming large amounts of fiber, they will probably spend a lot of time on a toilet. I think that once those two nutrients are introduced in the appropriate amounts, then we can fill in the remaining amount of calories with whatever is required to maintain the overall health. Because don't forget that, if you're not eating, you're also not delivering the necessary building blocks for your hormones, your cells into your body, right? You need a certain amount of energy or food that comes with certain amounts of minerals and vitamins that are required for the proper function of your body.
In fact, I've seen a lot of people apply that, whether they intentionally do it or because of an effect of using a weight loss medication where they will not eat for a day or two or three, but their weight doesn't change. In fact, sometimes it goes up.
Yes.
And that makes complete sense in that context. So I think that's also another misconception. And another reason for highlighting fiber in this particular conversation is because of all of the gastrointestinal side effects that tend to be very common, even at lower doses of semaglutide as well.
That is correct. And
Mhm.
you're right. I mean, if you're thinking about your health uh, or weight loss in the perspective of 2 days, then maybe you shouldn't have even started dieting, because you're not mentally in the right place just yet, right? The people have a certain tendency, people's bodies have a certain genetically pre-programmed tendency to remain at a certain level of, or maintain a certain level of body fat. And while it's easy to dysregulate, it means that the further you deviate from your, let's say, pre-programmed body weight, the more difficult the maintenance of that weight becomes.
Mm.
Yes, your weight will fluctuate depending on what you eat, on the time of the day, when and how you weigh yourself, but it's a lifelong journey.
That's right.
Losing and maintaining wealth and maintaining healthy is a lifelong journey. And if you are stepping on the scales every day and wondering whether, oh, I've started injecting myself, or I stopped eating and nothing has changed. I mean, if that's how you're looking at your weight loss, you're probably not ready to start on any lifestyle change just yet. You're just mentally in a very wrong place. I believe that even on pharmaceutical interventions, right, we expect at least 4 weeks to see any change, right? And if there isn't any, then we continue increasing the dose up to a certain level. So it's just a wrong approach. You have to change your perspective, and you need to start thinking not about what your weight and health is going to be tomorrow or in 3 hours from now. You need to start thinking what your weight will be 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Will you be able to travel independently, right? Can you climb 3 flights of stairs back to your apartment? Can you carry your groceries or get to the car? I mean, those types of things, the more kind of end of life or final decades of your life, questions become far more important. Not how much you will show, how much weight you will have shown in scale 3 days from now. I think that's irresponsible, and it probably indicates you're in a wrong place.
Yeah. And this is why speaking with somebody a little bit deeper to understand why, what your motivations are, what's important to you, or just reframe what what your goals are is really important at any point before you start, while you're there, just to understand how how to maintain this for a longer term.
That is correct. So I think we've covered the drugs in sufficient detail today and the consequences of using them, the risks associated with losing them.
Mhm.
And we talked a lot about how we can use them rationally,
Mm.
because again, this is in a certain way a medical breakthrough that allows to effectively help people with obesity and diabetes as well. But it helps people to lose weight in a way that we have not been able to do before. But it has to be done in a very carefully thought through way. Hopefully, the conversation we had today will help people to achieve this.
Mhm.
And I believe, yes, Sarah, in our next episode, we will maybe focus a little bit more or discuss a little bit more in general on the success of weight loss. How many people manage to maintain it and what are the reasons for bouncing back.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talk about rebound on the next one.
Yes, when we return.